It was a crisp Friday evening in downtown Chicago, the kind of night where the wind carried a bite but the city lights made up for it. The Ambrosia Lounge, a high-end fusion restaurant nestled between marble buildings, buzzed with chatter and laughter. Businesspeople toasted the end of the week while jazz music flowed from hidden speakers. In the midst of this elegant setting, waiters glided from table to table, balancing crystal glasses and porcelain plates with quiet grace. Among them was Marcus, a tall, well-spoken black man in his early 30s with a calm, steady presence. His coworkers respected him, and regular customers often asked for him by name. He carried himself with a sense of quiet pride that came from knowing who he was, no matter what others might assume. That evening, Marcus was assigned to the private lounge, a plush area reserved for VIP guests and special events. Tonight's reservation belonged to a group of corporate executives from a prominent tech company celebrating their latest acquisition. Among them was their CEO, a brash, middle-aged man named Edward Talbot, known for his no-nonsense attitude, larger-than-life personality, and infamous lack of tact. The executives rolled in, laughing and drinking before they'd even sat down. Marcus approached them with his usual professionalism, offering menus and describing the evening's specials with his warm but neutral tone. At first, the group barely acknowledged him, too engrossed in their own bravado. But when Marcus politely corrected one of the executives who had mispronounced a dish's French name, doing so with grace, as he was trained to, Talbot turned his attention to him. There was something in his tone, something smug and challenging, when he asked, "Oh, you speak French now?" His voice carried that condescending lilt that could dress up an insult as a joke. Marcus smiled mildly, nodding. "Yes, I studied it in college, along with a few other languages." "Oh really?" Talbot said, leaning back in his chair. "How impressive." But it wasn't a compliment. His words were dipped in disbelief, in mockery, as though he was performing for the rest of the table. They chuckled. Not because the comment was funny, but because Talbot's tone made it clear they were supposed to laugh. Marcus stood still, his posture perfect, not a flicker of offense crossing his face. He had heard this kind of thing before, sometimes subtle, sometimes obvious. The surprise, the disbelief, the insinuation that someone who looked like him couldn't possibly be well-read or multilingual. "Well then," Talbot continued, swirling his scotch with a smirk, "if you're so smart, then translate it." He pointed randomly to the back of the wine list, where there was a short paragraph in Italian, probably copied from some regional vineyard description. The table fell silent, waiting for Marcus to stumble or stammer, anticipating his failure as part of the evening's entertainment. Without skipping a beat, Marcus glanced at the text and began to recite it in English, fluid and accurate, his pronunciation crisp, his cadence unhurried. His voice rang clear and smooth as he explained the vineyard's location, the wine's aging process, and its flavor profile. When he finished, he looked at Talbot, not smugly, not with challenge, just as someone who had simply done what he was asked. The silence that followed was not the amused pause Talbot had expected. Instead, it hung heavy, awkward. A few of the executives shifted in their seats. One of them, possibly the CFO, let out a quiet, surprised, "Damn." Talbot, for a moment, looked stunned. His smile had frozen, the corners of his mouth still upturned, but his eyes betrayed him. He had expected a joke, a fumble, a moment of superiority. Instead, he had been met with competence and dignity. That made him uncomfortable. Trying to regain control of the moment, Talbot scoffed. "Well, I guess you wasted your education pouring wine." The tone was light, dismissive, but the insult was clear. Still, Marcus didn't react. "Not wasted," he said calmly. "I enjoy working here. Besides, intelligence isn't about the job you have, it's about how you carry yourself, how you treat others." That line didn't come from a place of defiance. It was simply truth, delivered with composure. But in that moment, it hit harder than any raised voice ever could. A few more seconds of silence passed before one of the younger executives, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, mumbled something about ordering another bottle. The spell broke. The conversation shifted. The moment moved on. But not for Talbot. Though he forced a laugh and carried on with the evening, something had changed. His usual confidence was cracked, his jokes a little more forced. For the rest of the dinner, he avoided direct eye contact with Marcus. When Marcus returned with their food, Talbot mumbled a thank you, his gaze glued to the table. Later that night, as the staff cleaned up and the last of the guests filtered out, Marcus moved through the lounge, collecting glasses and folding napkins. He didn't mention the encounter to anyone. There was no need to. People like Talbot always believed the world worked a certain way, and they hated being reminded otherwise. As he wiped down the table where the executives had sat, one of the junior team members, clearly a new hire, approached him. "Hey," she said, her voice low, her expression sincere. "That was really impressive. You handled him perfectly." Marcus nodded politely, offering a small smile. "Thank you," he said. Then he continued with his work. Because for Marcus, that moment wasn't about revenge or showing off. It was about dignity, about not allowing someone else's ignorance to define your worth, about standing in your truth, even when others try to mock it. And Talbot, who had walked in expecting to be the most powerful man in the room, had discovered something far more unsettling than a smart waiter. He discovered someone he couldn't belittle, someone who didn't flinch, someone who had earned respect not with title or wealth, but with quiet, undeniable strength. That was the part that froze him. Not the translation, but the realization that all the power he thought he held could be undone. Not with a shout, but with a sentence spoken clearly, and the unshakable presence of a man who knew exactly who he was. The following Monday morning, Edward Talbot sat in his glass-walled office on the 42nd floor of his company's headquarters, his gaze fixed on the skyline but his thoughts far from it. He was known for his short attention span during quiet moments, always pacing, always on a call, always moving. But now, he was unusually still, his fingers laced together, elbows resting on his polished mahogany desk. The encounter from Friday night replayed in his mind on an irritating loop, the waiter's calm voice, the perfect translation, and above all, that unwavering composure that left him, for once, unsure of himself. Edward wasn't used to being bested, especially not in public. His success had been built on dominance, speaking louder, pushing harder, laughing when others flinched. And it had worked. He'd taken a mid-tier software company and turned it into a billion-dollar firm. But that moment at the restaurant had exposed something in him he didn't want to acknowledge. He had meant to humiliate the man and instead had embarrassed himself. What bothered him most wasn't even the translation. It was the look. That quiet, unshakable confidence Marcus had. The look of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to say, if he chose to. That kind of grace, especially coming from someone Edward had written off in a second, unsettled him more than he cared to admit. His executive assistant, Claire, stepped in after knocking lightly. "Your 9 o'clock is waiting," she said. Edward blinked and shook the thoughts from his head. Send them in. Meetings came and went. Budget updates, product discussions, a new marketing campaign, but his mind kept drifting. By lunch, he was irritable, snapping at small things. A slide with the wrong color palette, a manager who hesitated mid-sentence. Claire, ever composed, asked if he wanted to reschedule his afternoon. He declined. Part of him hated how rattled he felt. The other part needed to prove it hadn't gotten under his skin. But it had. Later that day, during a boardroom meeting, someone brought up a potential diversity and inclusion initiative. The company had been criticized in the press for a lack of representation in leadership roles. Normally, Edward brushed those topics aside, letting HR handle the optics. But today, he found himself listening. Really listening. The board members tossed around buzzwords, equity, belonging, outreach, but none of them had a clear plan. They just wanted to look better. "Let's stop talking about surface-level fixes," Edward said suddenly, leaning forward. "If we're going to talk about diversity, let's talk about the talent pipeline. Who we recruit, who we invest in. Let's find people who are overlooked, not just for PR points, but because we've been missing out on skill." There was a pause. It wasn't like him to talk this way. Some board members nodded, others looked confused. He didn't elaborate, he didn't mention Marcus. But his mind was back in that lounge, hearing the calm in that waiter's voice and realizing how blind he'd been. After the meeting, he returned to his office and sat again in silence. Then, on impulse, he pulled out his phone and searched for Ambrosia Lounge. He found the number and dialed. "Ambrosia Lounge, how may I help you? This is Edward Talbot. I was there last Friday." "I'd like to speak to the manager." There was a brief pause, followed by a pleasant voice. "This is Laura, the manager. How can I help you, Mr. Talbot?" "I had a waiter, Marcus. Tall guy, speaks several languages." "Yes, Marcus, one of our best." Edward hesitated. "I wanted to thank him personally." "That's very kind," Laura replied. "He's not in today, but I can pass along your message." Edward tapped the edge of his desk, thinking. "Do you know if he's ever worked in tech?" "Tech?" Laura sounded amused. "No, not that I know of. He has a master's degree, though. Linguistics, I think. Brilliant guy. Teaches night classes sometimes." Edward hung up soon after, not quite sure why he'd called in the first place. But the curiosity gnawed at him. He'd dismissed Marcus as a waiter. But clearly, he was more. And the more Edward thought about it, the more he realized how often he probably dismissed people like that. People whose names he didn't bother to remember, whose skills he never imagined extended beyond their uniforms. The next day, Edward instructed HR to begin reaching out to local universities and community programs. He didn't tell them why, just that he wanted to meet professionals with unconventional backgrounds. People not from Ivy League schools. People with stories. It seemed to confuse them at first, but they complied. His status as CEO didn't demand explanations. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his work, unaware of the stir he had caused. His life wasn't defined by singular encounters. He had bills to pay, students to teach, and goals of his own. What happened that Friday night? It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him, and it wouldn't be the last. He didn't dwell on it. He just carried on, the same way he always had. But a week later, Ambrosia's manager approached him during a break. "You made quite an impression," Laura said. "Oh, that tech CEO you served. He called. Wanted to thank you." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's so." Laura nodded. "He even asked if you'd worked in tech." Marcus gave a short laugh. "Not unless you count fixing the restaurant printer every week." She smiled. "Maybe you should." That evening, Marcus found himself thinking more deeply about his own path. He'd always been passionate about languages, about teaching, about connecting across culture and understanding. But he also knew he had skills that stretched beyond academia or food service. He'd taught himself basic coding years ago. He was good with systems, with logic, with patterns. He had simply never had the door open for him to explore those things in a new setting. He had never had someone with power take a second look. And while he didn't place much weight on a single man's opinion, the notion that someone like Edward Talbot had paused, had seen him differently, even for a moment, stuck with him. 3 weeks later, Marcus received an email from someone in Talbot's company. A vague invitation to a networking dinner they were hosting for emerging professionals from non-traditional fields. At first, Marcus nearly deleted it. He wasn't interested in being a charity case or someone's redemption arc. But then he reconsidered. What if this was real? What if it wasn't about pride or forgiveness or proving anything? What if it was simply a new door? So he RSVP'd yes. And as he stood in front of his closet that Friday night, ironing a shirt with practiced care, he thought not about Talbot or the lounge or the moment of insult, but about possibility. Because the truth was, sometimes change begins not with grand gestures but with uncomfortable silences, with frozen smiles, with the moment one man realizes another man cannot be diminished. And Marcus, well, he wasn't afraid of being seen anymore.